In this video, we're going to be talking about the 5 biggest mistakes to avoid when working with watercolor. So whether you're a beginner or a more advanced watercolorist, I guarantee you're currently making one of these mistakes. If not, you will make them one day. So in this video, I'm going over the 5 biggest mistakes that every watercolorist makes and how to avoid them. So let's dive right in. Okay, so the first biggest mistake, and in my opinion, the most important, the one I want to call the most attention to, is cheap watercolor supplies. A lot of people cut corners with their supplies. I totally get it. Watercolor, paint supplies, and general art supplies, they can be expensive. They can add up in cost, especially if you're loading up your palette with a lot of colors. Like I have 12 colors. It looks like a whole lot more colors, but I duplicate a lot of the colors. So it does add up in cost, and I totally get it. But if you're able to invest in good supplies, you're investing in your practice. And if you enjoy your practice and the process of painting, you're going to want to practice more. And so if you're seeing results that maybe your colors aren't looking as bright and vivid as an artist you follow on Instagram, or you're not able to blend and get smooth gradients with your colors, or lift color off of your paper, or soak up and absorb a lot of water and pigment with your brushes, well, the problem is you could get 10 times better results if you just invest in good supplies. Number one part of this mistake is a lot of people cut corners on their brushes and on their paper. Paint is also really important too, but a lot of people kind of invest all of their money, all their budget in the paint, and then they kind of just like, Canson watercolor paper or this watercolor paper or whatever will work fine. And these cheap brushes that I got in a set that are all like busted looking and weird and not very flexible or easy to use. But the problem is you're going to get really, really frustrated with your results. Your colors are going to dry really, really faded when they land on cheap watercolor paper. And 100% cotton paper is really sturdy and absorbent. And so you're going to get a lot of warping, a lot of buckling if you're not using good paper. And you're not going to have the absorbency and the flexibility that you would have with good brushes like the brushes I use. And we link in all of our videos if you are cutting corners with your brushes. So number one biggest mistake I see a lot of watercolorists make is supplies. So invest in some good supplies. Every artist is different. I love Winsor Newton paints. I love Legion paper, Stonehenge Aqua cold press paper, and I love Princeton brushes. You guys know that. If you've been around my channel for long enough, then you know that I always use these supplies. But some other watercolorists prefer Arches or prefer Holbein watercolor or Da Vinci. And so find what works for you, what you love. These supplies are bomb, and I wouldn't recommend them if I didn't love them or didn't think they were good. So check them out. And then the next mistake is puddling. So we did an entire video on water control. We'll link it in this video, so make sure you go watch it. It's super helpful. But a lot of watercolorists add way too much water, and they do what's called puddling. Don't mind my chewed up watercolor paper. My cat got to this paper. But what happens a lot of times is watercolor artists will grab too much water on their brush. Will load up with too much water and go to lay down a stroke or a swatch or a petal if they're painting flowers, etc. And it's kind of lifted up, kind of like a dome of pigment and water. And that puddle is going to take forever to dry, but then it's also not going to, if you're wanting to blend with it or create bursts or blooms of watercolor, it's going to act like a wall. The water acts like a wall, and you won't see a nice blend or burst of pigment into that area of wet stroke, petal, whatever you painted. And so you just want a thin sheen of wetness if you're trying to use blending techniques or wet and wet painting specifically. So this is what I see a lot of times when people, let's just paint a petal, for example. I'm going to load up with Scarlet Lake, and in the water control video that we'll link here, I go over some tips that will help you with your water control so you don't create those puddles. But a lot of times people go to their paper with that much water, and they're only going to be painting like this big of an area on their paper, and it just creates a big puddle. So if you have a lot of water on your brush and you're seeing this huge kind of lifted dome situation, like I said, it's going to take forever to dry, but that puddle, the water is going to push the actual pigment, so the minerals of the pigment, to the edges of that puddle, and it's going to create a hard line or a darker edge or outline to that petal. And a lot of people get frustrated by that and how that looks, and they're not sure how to fix it, and it's because you're creating puddles. So puddling is the second biggest mistake. Instead, you want to create just a light sheen where there's still movement happening. So I know this is still wet, and I can create wet and wet if I want to, but it's not lifted like a dome. Struggle bus so much. Trying to get the shot. Out of control. So the third tip, or the third biggest mistake that people make, is they give up on a piece too soon. So for example, let's say I was painting a floral border like this one, and I didn't like this little cluster over here. Because it's so busy and we can keep adding layers on top of layers with watercolor, same thing with oil or acrylic, we can usually, if we have patience, recover a piece. And a lot of times, especially beginners, they kind of call it quits too soon. And there's a lot you can do to save a piece, especially when it's still wet. You can lift color with a paper towel and kind of use it to act like an eraser to lift if something's too dark. Or you didn't like something that you painted, you can lift it with a dry paper towel, etc. So have patience. A lot of people give up too soon. And then the fourth mistake that people make is they start too dark too soon. So in the sky tutorial that we posted last week, I painted a couple of skies, 3 different skies actually. And I kept preaching about how you need to start super light, because once these sky backgrounds dry, you can go back in and add darker layers to add dimension and depth to these clouds. You can paint water on top of this bottom section here, and maybe like a little mountainscape or cliffs in the background. So you add dimension and depth as you go. You get darker as you go with watercolor. Watercolor does dry lighter than when it's wet on your paper, so there's that, but you want to make sure that you're always starting lighter than you think you should, and you can, while it's still wet or whatever, you can always add more color and make it darker. So the fifth mistake that I see very commonly is the opposite of puddling, and it's your brush is too dry. Some people work a little bit heavier and more intensely, and they grab a lot of pigment, and their pigment to water ratio is more like acrylic painting or oil painting. And while that is really useful at times, especially if you're wanting to add really concrete details that have a really clear contour or outline, you definitely want a lot of pigment on your brush to really create hard details. But a lot of times people are wanting to do these big big sweeping strokes for landscapes or big skies, expansive skies, and they don't have enough water on their brush. So there's this fine balance between pigment and water ratio, and we have a water control video that explains that even more further. So make sure you check that out. But those are the 5 biggest mistakes that I see watercolorists making: supplies, puddling, giving up too soon on a piece, starting too dark too soon, and the 5th one, not enough water, so dry brush all too often, etc. I'm in such a weird mood. Comment below. Let me know what was most helpful for you, which tip you resonate with the most, or which mistake you resonate with the most, that you make the most often, and I would love to help you out with further videos. So if you have any ideas for us, hit us up in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. But it is so high quality and good, so you can easily do some color lifting. Your colors are going to look vibrant and rich on this paper. They're not going to be dull or muted looking, and they're also going to blend really well. So a lot of cheaper watercolor papers, like Canson watercolor paper, for example, they